Let me tell you about a man who bought a piece of dead ground above Looney Creek in Harlan County, Kentucky, and what he did with it over the better part of 20 years. His name was Harlan Boyd, and the ground he bought lay on the far side of the hollow, straight across the creek from the old strip bench on Black Mountain, a place a body could take in whole from the near ridge, top to bottom. And on a cold, bright morning in the second week of October, 1988, Harlan Boyd walked up onto that ground that nobody in 3 counties believed would ever grow a thing again. Now here's what you need to understand about that slope. Back in the spring of 1948, a coal company came in with a steam shovel and cut the top off that ridge to get at a seam of coal running just under the crest. When they were done, they pushed the broken rock and the turned up subsoil over the side in a great gray fan, the way they did in those days, before anybody made them put it back. That loose broken ground is what they call spoil. They graded it rough and they left it, and for 40 years it sat there sour and bare. A little broom sedge held on at the edges, a few scraggly locusts, but the face of it stayed the color of ash. And when it rained, the water ran straight off orange and carried what little dirt there was down into the creek. 2 men had tried to run cattle across the top of it in the 60s, and both of them quit because the grass came in thin and yellow, and the cows lost weight standing on it. The county had it on the tax books for years and could not sell it. When Harlan bought the 40 acres of it that August, he paid less for the whole slope than a man pays for a good used truck. Harlan was 61 years old that fall, though you would not have guessed him a day under 70. He had gone down into the Benham mine as a boy of 17 and come up out of the mines for the last time when they closed the works in 1984. And 40 years underground had bent him and grayed him and put a rattle down in his chest that you could hear across a room. He was a widower by then. His wife Ruth had passed the winter before, and folks said he took it hard, though Harlan was not a man who let much show on his face. He was lean and slow-moving, with big scarred hands, and he wore the same gray work coat every day of his life. He kept to himself up the hollow in a 4-room house his own father had built. And most folks figured that when a man like that buys 40 acres of poisoned rock, he has finally let grief tip him over the edge. The morning this story begins, he came up the Hall Road with a wheelbarrow, and in that wheelbarrow were 2 5-gallon buckets. He set them at the foot of the slope, and then he took a long iron bar with a pointed end and a little step welded to it, and he began driving holes down into the hard gray spoil, one after another, working his way up the face in a slow row. From a quarter-mile off, you could not tell what he was pouring out of those buckets into the holes he made. It looked like he was feeding the mountain by the spoonful. He worked until the sun was straight up, and then he loaded his tools and went home. And the next morning he was back, and the morning after that. It did not take long for word to get around. There is a little store down at the mouth of the hollow, Combs's store, where the men gather in the mornings, and that week they were at it. Old Dillard Combs was behind the counter grinning. "Harlan Boyd's took to farming rocks," he said, and the men laughed. Somebody said he had heard Harlan was going to plant an orchard up on Black Mountain, and that set them off worse. "An orchard," a man named Estep said, wiping his eyes. "On the spoil bank. Why, that ground won't grow a cocklebur. It killed grass, it killed cows, and a sick old man with a poke of seed is going to make it grow trees." They all agreed it was a shame. A man his age, all alone since Ruth passed, up there talking to a slope that had been dead longer than some of them had been living. And truth be told, most everyone thought the same thing. All that whole first month he was out there, driving his holes and pouring his buckets, a small gray figure against a gray hill, and not a soul could for the life of them see the sense in it. But there was something in the steadiness of it that made a person keep looking. He never hurried. He never stood back to admire what he had done, because there was nothing yet to admire. He just worked his row, filled his holes, and came back the next day and started where he had left off. A man does not work like that out of madness. A man works like that when he knows something the rest of them do not. And here is the thing that none of them down at Combs's store had thought to ask, laughing over their coffee that October. Not one of them had wondered what a man does with 40 years of knowing the inside of a mountain better than he knows his own front room. They saw a widower and a dead hill and a bucket of something, and they made it into a joke. But nobody yet knew what Harlan Boyd meant to plant up there, or why he had picked the one crop that could grow on ground that had murdered everything else. That part he kept to himself the whole first winter. Here is something worth knowing. When a strip mine is cut, and the broken rock and subsoil are pushed aside as spoil, what is left is not soil at all. The living topsoil, with its worms and roots and fungi built up over thousands of years, is gone or buried. What remains is raw, crushed rock, packed so hard by machines that roots and water can barely enter it. Worse, coal spoil often contains pyrite, and when pyrite meets air and water, it turns to sulfuric acid, sinking the soil so sour that most plants cannot feed. That is why such ground can lie bare for decades. Nothing is left to build on, and what is there fights back. Now here's the part that takes a while to understand. What looked like the foolishness of a grieving old man was in fact the most careful work a person could do, and Harlan Boyd was maybe the one man in that whole valley who had any business trying it. You have to remember where his knowledge came from. Harlan had spent 44 years underneath that very ridge. He had crawled the seams and walked the entries under the Black Mountain bench in the dark, and he knew, the way you know your own kitchen in the night, exactly what lay beneath that gray face. He knew where the old limestone shelf ran under the spoil because he had drilled into it. He knew where the water moved because he had spent his working life fighting to keep it out of the mine. When the rest of them looked at that slope and saw a flat gray ruin, Harlan looked at it and saw the bones of a mountain he had lived inside. And he knew its weaknesses and its one or two mercies better than the men who owned it ever had. The first thing he did, that whole first year, was fight the sourness. The truth of it came out the following spring, when a neighbor finally walked over and asked him plainly what he was doing. He was not a talkative man, but he did not send the fellow off. He picked up a handful of the gray spoil and let it run through his fingers. "This ground's soured," he said. "Acid. You could pour seed on it till doomsday and it'd never come up." Those buckets he had been carrying up the slope all fall had been full of ground limestone and lime kiln dust, hauled 40 miles from a plant over near the river, and he was working it down into every hole he punched, one hole at a time, all the way up that face. He was sweetening the ground by hand, the way you would sweeten 40 acres of sourdough one spoonful at a time. It would take him 3 years of hauling before he trusted the soil enough to plant the thing he was really after. And in the meantime, he planted something else. That second spring, he set out row after row of little whip-thin black locust seedlings, hundreds of them, all across the lower slope. The men at Combs's store had a fine time with that too, because black locust is a weed tree, a briar patch tree, and who plants a weed on purpose? But Harlan knew what he was doing. Black locust will grow on the poorest ground there is. It fixes nitrogen down at its roots and feeds the dead soil around it. And it drops its little leaves every fall to start building a layer of duff where there had been nothing but rock. He was not planting locust for locust. He was planting it to nurse the ground back to life, to throw a little shade and hold the spoil in place, and start the slow work of making dirt where there was none. He called them his nurse trees. "They'll do the rough work," he said, "and then the good trees can come in behind." The good trees. That was the whole of it. And here is where you understand what kind of a bet Harlan Boyd was making. What he meant to grow up there, on ground that had been dead for 40 years, was chestnuts. American chestnut, and the blight-resistant kind bred to stand where the old ones had fallen. Now you have to know what the chestnut meant to a man like Harlan. His grandfather had told him how these mountains once stood thick with them, how 1 tree in 4 on the ridges was a chestnut. How the nuts fell so deep in the fall that hogs and turkeys and children all fattened on them. And how a man could get his cash money for the year hauling sacks of chestnuts to town. And then a sickness came out of the east, back before Harlan was born, and inside of 40 years it killed nearly every chestnut in the whole range. Harlan had grown up hearing about a forest that was gone before he could walk in it. And now, an old man with a rattle in his chest, he meant to put it back. On the one dead slope nobody else wanted, knowing full well how long it takes. Because that was the thing that made the men laugh hardest when they found out. A chestnut does not pay you back quick. You put a seedling in the ground and you wait. It does not bear a single nut for 7 or 8 years, and it does not come into its real strength for 20 or 30. And a chestnut set out today is a tree your grandchildren walk under. Harlan Boyd was 62 years old with bad lungs, planting a crop he had almost no chance of living to see grown. "That old fool," Estep said down at the store. Is planting a forest, he'll be dead before it shades him. And they laughed, and they made their bets. Somebody bet a case of pop that the slope would beat him, that the ground would win the way it always had, that a sick old man would give it up inside of 2 years and they would find the whole thing grown back to broom sedge. Harlan heard about the bets. Combs's store is not a place where a thing stays quiet. He never answered them. He just went up his slope every good day there was, sweetening his ground and tending his nurse trees, moving at that same slow, steady pace. A man in a gray coat working a gray hill toward a green thing none of the rest of them could see. He was reading that mountain like a book he had been 40 years learning to read, and he was in no hurry at all. And then came the spring he judged the ground was ready. The spring he finally set his first chestnut seedlings into the soil he had spent 3 years sweetening. It was the spring of 1990. He put in near 200 little trees, and he watered them. And for a few weeks they held. And then the sky closed up over eastern Kentucky, and it did not rain. Not a drop worth counting, for the whole rest of that summer. Here is something worth knowing. Sour soil can be healed, but it takes patience. Ground limestone slowly neutralizes acid and raises the pH, unlocking the food already in the soil so roots can finally take it up. But lime works only where it is worked in, and it can take years to change ground that is badly soured. And bare dead spoil is often started not with the crop you want, but with tough nurse plants like black locust, which fix their own nitrogen, tolerate poor ground, and begin building the leaf litter and shade that better, slower trees will need before they can ever take hold. And this is the part that matters, the part worth remembering about Harlan Boyd. It is easy to admire a man when his work is done, and the green is up, and everybody has come around. The hard thing, the thing almost nobody has in them, is to keep going through the long middle years when there is nothing to show, and everyone you know is sure you are a fool. That summer of 1990 was the worst drought anybody up the hollow could remember. From the middle of May to the last of September, there was hardly a rain worth naming. The creek ran to a string of green pools. And up on the Black Mountain bench, one by one, Harlan's near 200 little chestnut trees curled their leaves and browned and dried to bare brown sticks. It was a hard thing to watch happen, even for folks who were only neighbors looking on. By the first frost, he had maybe 30 seedlings left alive out of the whole planting, and even those looked poorly. 3 years of hauling lime, a winter and 2 springs of work, and the ground had won again, the way Estep and the rest had said it would. A neighbor walked over one evening that fall, half expecting to find him ready to quit. He was standing among his dead sticks with a bucket in each hand. He had been carrying water up that slope by hand, 2 buckets at a time from the creek, 40 and 50 trips a day through the worst of it. An old man with ruined lungs climbing a spoil bank in the heat to keep 30 little trees alive. He set the buckets down and wiped his face. And he did not say anything about the 200 trees that had died. He said, "I set 'em too high and too fast. My fault, not the ground's." That was all. He had grieved his wife the winter before, and it seemed he had learned to carry a loss without dropping everything else he was holding. He poured his water, and he came back the next day. Now here is what he did, and it is why he was not really a fool at all. He did not just replant the same trees in the same holes and pray for rain. He went back and read the ground again. He remembered from his years underneath it an old seep line that came out along one bench of the slope, a place where water moved close under the surface even in a dry year. He had planted his first trees up on the high dry face because it was easier ground to work. Now he moved his planting down to the seep line, into the damp draw. And he mulched every seedling deep with the leaf litter his black locusts had finally begun to drop, to hold what water there was. He started over. He was 63 years old, and he started the whole thing over, on better chosen ground, with the little he had left. The years after that ran together, and they were lean years for watching. There is not much to see in a chestnut planting that is doing everything right, because everything right in a chestnut looks like waiting. The deer found his seedlings and browsed them, and he built cages of wire around each one. The cost of it ate what little he had, and folks said the Boyd place was going down for taxes the way the slope had. His lungs got worse, and some winters he was not seen on the slope for weeks, and folks worried he had passed up there alone. The men at Combs's store mostly quit talking about him. He had become an old story, a sad one. The miner who threw his last years at a dead hill. Even those who saw the slope every morning stopped expecting anything. The nurse locusts filled in and through their shade, and under them, if you walked up close, you could find Harlan's chestnuts in their wire cages, knee-high, then waist-high, then over a man's head, slow and quiet, year on year. But from across the hollow, the slope just looked like it was going back to brush. And in a way, it was. It was going back to being alive. And then came the morning that turned it. It was a cool, bright day late in September, and it must have been 1997 or thereabouts, a full 9 years after he drove that first hole. Harlan came down the Hall Road slower than usual, and he came all the way down to the mouth of the hollow, into Combs's store, which he almost never did. The men were there at their coffee. He walked up to the counter, and he reached into the pocket of that gray coat, and he set something down on the wood in front of Dillard Combs. It was a chestnut, one single brown chestnut, round and shining, backed out of a green burr that morning. The first sound nut grown on the Black Mountain bench in 40 years. Maybe the first grown in that whole hollow since the blight took the old trees before any of them were born. Nobody laughed. Estep picked it up and turned it over in his fingers like it was a coin from a country he'd never heard of. Harlan did not make a speech. He took the nut back and he put it in his pocket and he said, "There'll be more." And he walked out and went back up his slope. But word of it was all over before dark, the whole hollow knew. And something changed in the way people said his name after that day. Here is something worth knowing. The American chestnut once ruled these mountains until a fungus called chestnut blight arrived from Asia around the turn of the last century and, within about 40 years, killed some 3 to 4 billion trees, nearly the entire species. The roots often live and send up sprouts, but the blight kills them back before they can bear. For 100 years, breeders have crossed the American chestnut with the blight-resistant Chinese chestnut, backcrossing over many tree generations to keep the American form while borrowing the resistance. Even so, a chestnut needs 7 years or more before it fruits, so planting one is always an act of patience. And that's when everything changed, though change came the way it always did with Harlan, slow and without any fuss. There was more, just like he said there would be. The next fall, there were a few dozen burrs, and the fall after that, a few hundred. And by the early 2000s, the whole lower slope of the Black Mountain bench, the ground that had been gray and dead for 40 years, wore a crown of green in the summer and dropped its spiny burrs in the fall thick enough that you had to watch your step. The trees he had moved down to the seep line had grown tall and full, and behind them the higher plantings he'd tried again on the sweetened ground had taken too, so that the bare face of the spoil bank was gone, healed over, turned into a young chestnut wood, and the living things came back to it. That is the part worth trying to see. First the jays, screaming and hauling nuts off to bury on the ridges, then the squirrels, then, one gray November dawn, 11 wild turkeys came working down through Harlan's trees, scratching in the leaf litter for mast, on ground that had not fed so much as a cricket in a lifetime. The deer that used to browse his seedlings now fattened on the nuts. A slope that men had abandoned because its starved cattle was feeding half the wild things in the hollow. Word of it spread past the valley. One spring, a forestry professor drove up from the university with 2 students, and they walked Harlan's rows all day with clipboards, and the professor told him that what he had done, one old man by hand, was the sort of thing whole agencies wrote grant money to try and mostly failed at. A restoration outfit that worked on old strip mines came and asked could they bring people to see it, and Harlan, who never liked a crowd, said they could come in the fall if they helped gather. And they did. By the middle 2000s, there was a Saturday every October when 30 or 40 people came up the Black Mountain bench with feed sacks to pick chestnuts. And Dillard Combs kept a wooden bin down at the store with a hand-lettered sign that said Boyd's Chestnuts. And folks bought them by the pound to roast. And the men who had laughed came around, the way men do. Estep, who had bet a case of pop that the ground would beat him, came up the slope every fall with a sack of his own, and never once mentioned the bet. And Harlan never once made him. That is a kind of grace you do not always see in the mountains, or anywhere. They just picked nuts together in the cool air under trees that had not existed when the bet was made. 2 old men. And let the trees say what needed saying. Harlan himself did not change at all. He was near 80 by then, and slower, and the rattle in his chest had gotten deep, but he still put on the same gray coat and walked his rows most every good day. He never took much money for the nuts and gave more away than he sold. Fame, if you could call it that, sat on him like rain on a rock. When the professor's students asked him how he'd known it would work, he said he hadn't known any such thing. He'd just known the ground, and the ground had told him where to try. He would not take credit for it. He said the trees did the growing. All he did was carry water and wait. Harlan Boyd passed in the winter he was 82, in the 4-room house his father built. And half the county came up Looney Creek for the burying. They laid him on the ridge above his own slope where he could keep his eye on it. And folks have walked up there many times since to see the trees he made. There is one thing up there worth leaving you with, because it holds the whole of it better than anything a person could say. Leaned up against the trunk of the biggest chestnut on the slope, the first one that ever bore, there is an old iron planting bar, pointed at the end, with a little step welded to it, gone orange with rust now. It is the same bar he drove holes with that cold October morning in 1988, his grandfather's bar before it was his. And the tree it leans against has grown so thick in the years since that a grown man cannot get his arms halfway around it. The bar and the tree, standing there together in the wind on ground that was dead for 40 years. It does not need any explaining, but the last of it belongs in Harlan's own words. Somebody asked him once near the end why a man his age had ever bothered starting something he'd never lived to see finished. He was quiet a while, the way he always was, and then he said, "My granddad planted trees he knew he'd never sit under, so I'd have shade. I never did have any children to plant for, so I planted for whoever comes after." A man that only plants what he'll live to harvest, he said, hasn't understood what a tree is for. You put it in the ground for the ones you'll never meet, and you tend it, and then you let it go on without you. That's the whole of it. That's the only part that ever mattered. Here is something worth knowing. Reforesting old mine land is one of the surest ways to heal it. Loosening the packed spoil lets roots and rain back in, and hardy trees begin rebuilding soil from the top down as their leaves rot into litter. Underground, fungi called mycorrhizae join with tree roots and knit the dead ground into living soil that holds water and feeds new growth. Nut trees like the chestnut add mass that brings back turkey, deer, and songbirds, while the roots slow erosion, clear the runoff, and mend the whole watershed below, one slow season at a time.